Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally flips a core psychological assumption completely on its head. We're looking at when overwhelm isn't actually about having poor boundaries, but is instead a deep signal of ancestral resonance. If you've ever sat through one of those corporate leadership seminars, you were probably taught a very specific definition of what a healthy boundary is, right? But what if I told you that exact definition might actually be fracturing the deepest layer of human connection in your organization? Let's jump right in.
So, let's start by challenging a psychological standard that we usually just accept as gospel. In traditional psychology, if you get completely overwhelmed by someone else's tragedy, well, you're usually diagnosed as lacking emotional differentiation. Basically, they say you have poor boundaries. The gold standard for emotional maturity is supposed to be maintaining this calm, separate sense of self while you offer support. But here's the thing. Behavioral science and dynamic programming models are exposing a massive prediction gap with this. What these standard empathy frameworks totally fail to test is whether this so-called maturity is actually a universal human truth, or if it's just one highly specific cultural lens.
And we actually have the hard data to back this up. We're looking at global SDTEST polling here, over 1,200 responses across 86 different countries. When we look at the purple vMEME and spiral dynamics, and for those who need a quick refresher, that's our tribal ancestral psychological stage, there is a statistically significant negative correlation with rejecting emotional overwhelm. So what does that actually mean in plain English? It means the purple mindset absolutely does not see emotional overwhelm as a weakness. Not at all. For them, it's a vital, deeply ingrained tribal resonance signal.
You can actually see this pattern crystal clear when you break down how different empathy metrics play out. The purple stage strongly aligns with actively mirroring someone's feelings. But, and this is fascinating, they completely reject things like simply feeling sorry for someone or sitting back and analytically imagining how they feel. Because to them, empathy is not some cognitive exercise. They experience tragedy as a shared ancestral field. Basically, if you aren't overwhelmed by the tragedy of someone in your tribe, well, you aren't really connected to the tribe, are you?
Now, the absolutely crucial point here is that when we experience the exact same event, say a colleague's tragedy, different psychological stages interpret the emotional requirement in wildly divergent ways. As we just saw, purple requires that shared ancestral resonance. But then you have green. Green sees empathy as a tool for individual emotional validation and relational repair. And meanwhile, blue looks at the exact same situation through a structural lens. They're seeking role-appropriate compassion within very strict ethical boundaries. It's the exact same emotional experience, but it triggers three completely different underlying logics. If you're managing a diverse team, just assuming everyone uses your specific logic is pretty much a recipe for disaster.
So how exactly does this build into a full-blown operational crisis? Well, when corporate frameworks treat not feeling overwhelmed as the ultimate metric of maturity, they literally strip away the tribal resonance signal. Think about that. For the purple-dominant folks in your workforce, their perfectly natural resonance is suddenly pathologized as a quote-unquote poor boundary. Your standard emotional intelligence training is fundamentally misaligned with their core tribal values. And when that ancestral connection fractures, trust quietly, steadily erodes. You don't usually get a dramatic walkout. Instead, you get what behavioral scientists call a silent tribal drift.
To actually stop this drift, we have to stop just analyzing what our employees do and start analyzing their psychological profiles. It requires a massive shift in how we measure human behavior. We have to rely on what mathematician Vladimir Lefebvre famously called the algebra of conscience. It's this genuinely radical idea that we can integrate the messy, chaotic reality of human psychology, our tribal instincts, our fears, our empathy, into a rigorous, mathematically stable dynamic programming model.
But to map these diverse empathy vectors without bias, we simply can't just look at behavior. Actions are really a lagging indicator, right? By the time someone's behavior actually drops off, they've probably already mentally quit months ago. We need a state vector that calculates 5 distinct layers all at the exact same time. We're talking about dropping down from surface-level actions into deep motivations through team leadership dynamics, diving into psychology and self-regulation, and finally grounding it all in fundamental structural and demographic realities.
And this brings us to a wildly fascinating technological shift called AI vibe coding. This is a huge trend peaking right now as we head into 2026, where users essentially instruct large language models in plain, natural language to build applications without writing traditional code. When you apply that here, these dynamic models use over 13,000 statistical correlations to literally turn the complex, messy soul of an organization into a solvable equation. By mapping the exact presence of these different mindsets right alongside real-time sensors like fear and trust, AI can essentially predict the future state of a company based entirely on those internal human signals.
Okay, let's make this tangible. Take a standard corporate action like initiating unpaid vacation. Standard logic says absolutely everyone hates this, and honestly, understandably so. But the data reveals some incredible hidden wiring. The purple tribal mindset actually accepts it, because they view it as a shared ritual sacrifice that bonds the group together. Green will accept it if it means saving their colleagues' jobs. But the orange achiever mindset, they aggressively reject it as a massive roadblock to their career progression. It's the exact same action, but it creates completely opposite systemic results depending on the psychological stage. If you don't calculate these exact state vectors, you are going to fall victim to massive unseen consequences. Take a standard cost-cutting measure like reducing staff. Your basic spreadsheet is going to say, great, we saved on payroll. But the dynamic model maps out the hidden butterfly effect. Firing staff spikes fear, which the data shows triggers latent survival instincts. That drives up things like ageism, as people desperately look for scapegoats. This completely destroys trust across the organization and ultimately leads to a total crash in leadership legitimacy. That basic spreadsheet was entirely blind to the fact that you literally just destroyed the company's social fabric.
This is exactly why the algorithm mathematically forces us to be better leaders. Just look at the dynamic model's scoring system. Direct financial costs obviously carries a heavy weight, pegged at 1.0. But employee fear is weighted almost as heavily, right there at 0.9, and well-being is right behind it at 0.8. The math inherently penalizes toxic workplaces. If you save $1 million but you completely terrify your staff in the process, the negative weight of that fear cancels out your financial gain. The system mathematically proves that a sick organism simply cannot be highly productive.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We so often treat empathy as this soft, unquantifiable feeling. But if empathy is actually computable, and if pathologizing tribal resonance destroys our foundations, we really have to ask ourselves, what breaks when empathy stops being ancestral resonance? And how do we design frameworks that preserve tribal holding, instead of just measuring individual boundary metrics? It's definitely something to think about as you review the dynamics of your own teams. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.